The mayor's words cut through the warm general store like a winter blade. Your husband was a thief and a liar, Mrs. Hart. Raven's Fork doesn't shelter criminals or their kin. Evelyn's wedding ring clattered onto the counter, her last possession of value, rejected like trash. Outside, the blizzard howled. Her 3 sons waited in the frozen dark. She had 1 hour before nightfall would claim them all. But the widow didn't know that her husband's death had hidden a secret worth killing for, or that salvation wore the face of a monster the whole town feared. If you want to see how a rejected widow and 3 starving boys survived the unforgivable, stay until the end. Like this video and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. The bell above the door of Brennan's General Store jingled with a cheerfulness that mocked everything Evelyn Hart felt. The warmth inside struck her face like a physical force, and for a moment, just one blessed moment, she forgot the 3 small bodies huddled in the broken wagon outside. Forgot the empty coin purse hanging from her belt. Forgot that her husband had been dead for 6 weeks, and that winter had decided to kill whatever he'd left behind. The store was crowded. Christmas Eve brought out everyone who had coin to spend or credit to abuse. Evelyn recognized the pattern immediately, the same pattern she'd seen in every town between here and the life she used to have. The men stood near the potbelly stove, warming hands and trading lies. The women clustered by the fabric bolts, fingers stroking calico and wool they couldn't afford. Children pressed their noses against the candy jars, breathing fog onto glass. Everyone stopped talking when they saw her. Evelyn had grown accustomed to the silence that followed her now. She was 32 years old but looked 50. Grief and hunger aged a woman faster than time ever could. Her dress, once a respectable gray wool, hung on her frame like a funeral shroud. Her hands, which had once been soft enough to play piano at church socials, were raw and split from driving a wagon through 1,000 miles of hell. But it was her eyes that made people look away. They were too direct, too knowing. They were the eyes of someone who had already lost everything and therefore had nothing left to fear. She walked to the counter. Her boots, Thomas's boots actually, cut down and stuffed with newspaper, left wet prints on the clean pine floor. The man behind the counter was Arthur Brennan, and she could tell from the way he straightened his shoulders that he'd already decided how this encounter would end. She'd seen that look before, too. "Help you?" His voice was professionally neutral, the tone of a shopkeeper who knew he was about to say no. "I need shelter for the night." Evelyn's voice didn't shake. She'd practiced this speech for 3 days, refining it, perfecting it, stripping away anything that sounded like begging. "I have 3 sons. The youngest is 5. There's a blizzard coming. I can pay." She reached into the pocket she'd sewn into her dress, the only pocket the bandits had missed, and pulled out her wedding ring. It was a simple band, 14-karat gold, worn thin by years of washing and work. Thomas had bought it with his first railroad wages before the war, before everything went wrong. It represented every promise they'd ever made to each other, every dream they'd built and lost. Evelyn set it on the counter between them. The store had gone absolutely silent. Even the children had stopped breathing fog on the candy jars. Arthur Brennan looked at the ring. He didn't touch it. "Ma'am, I run a general store, not a boarding house." "I know." Evelyn kept her voice steady. "But you have a storeroom. I saw it from outside. It has a stovepipe. We just need 1 night, maybe 2 until the storm passes. The ring is worth $20 at least. That's more than fair for 'I can't help you.'" 4 words, delivered with the finality of a coffin lid closing. Evelyn felt something crack inside her chest, but she didn't let it show. "Please, my boys." "I'm sorry about your situation, Mrs. Hart." He said her name like he'd been expecting her, like someone had warned him. "But this town has rules. We don't—" "What rules?" Evelyn's voice rose despite herself. "What rules say you can't show basic Christian mercy to—" "The rules that say we don't shelter thieves." The voice came from behind her, deep and confident, carrying the authority of a man who'd never been questioned in his life. Evelyn turned. Mayor Franklin Cole stood near the stove, warming his hands like a king warming himself at his own fire. He was 55, silver-haired, dressed in a wool suit that cost more than Evelyn had earned in her entire life. His face had the ruddy complexion of a man who ate well and often, who'd never missed a meal or wondered where the next one would come from. He smiled at her. It was the smile of a cat that had cornered a mouse and was deciding how long to play before the kill. Mayor Cole, Evelyn forced herself to nod respectfully, though every instinct screamed at her to run. I don't understand. I'm not a thief. I've never stolen anything in my... But your husband was... Cole stepped away from the stove, moving through the crowd like Moses parting the Red Sea. People shifted aside without even thinking about it, giving him room, giving him deference. Thomas Hart. Railroad engineer, wasn't he? Until they caught him with his hand in the company safe. That's not true. Evelyn's voice was steady, but her hands had begun to shake. My husband was accused, but he was never proven accused by 6 witnesses. Cole's voice was reasonable, educational, the tone of a teacher correcting a particularly slow student, including the company auditor who found him with $2,000 in stolen payroll money. He was going to return it. The words burst out before Evelyn could stop them. He borrowed it because we needed, our son was sick and the doctors wanted payment up front, and Thomas was going to put it back before anyone noticed, but he got caught. Cole spread his hands in a gesture of false sympathy. I'm sorry, Mrs. Hart, I truly am, but theft is theft, regardless of the reason. Your husband died before he could face trial, which saved him the shame of prison, but it doesn't change what he was. He was a good man, Evelyn's voice cracked. He made one mistake because he was desperate, and it killed him. The shame, the guilt? He couldn't live with it, and now he's gone, and I'm here with 3 boys who haven't eaten in 2 days and a storm coming that will kill us all if you don't. I can't help you. Cole's voice was gentle. That was what made it unbearable. He wasn't angry or disgusted. He was simply stating a fact, as immutable as the weather. This town was built on certain principles, Mrs. Hart. Honesty, hard work, justice. If we start making exceptions for criminals and their families, where does it end? What message does that send? Evelyn stared at him. Around her, the townspeople nodded. Some looked uncomfortable, but they nodded anyway. This was the man who owned half the buildings in Raven's Fork, who decided which businesses succeeded and which failed, who held the mortgage on most of their homes. Nobody was going to challenge him. Not for her. Not for anyone. My boys didn't steal anything, Evelyn whispered. They're children. Samuel is 8, Caleb is 7, Joseph is 5. They're innocent. I'm sure they are. Cole's smile never wavered. Which is why you should take them somewhere else. Somewhere that doesn't know about your husband's crimes. Start fresh. Build a new life. In a blizzard? Evelyn's voice rose to a shout. You're telling me to take 3 children into a blizzard with no shelter, no food, no... I'm telling you that actions have consequences, Mrs. Hart. Cole's voice hardened just slightly, enough to remind everyone in the room who held the power here. Your husband's actions brought shame to his family. That's tragic, but it's not our responsibility to fix. Now, I suggest you leave before you make this harder on yourself and your boys. Evelyn looked around the store. She met eyes. Women who'd probably buried children of their own, men who'd probably faced their own desperate moments, shopkeepers who knew what it was like to worry about next month's rent. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The silence was answer enough. Evelyn reached for her ring. Her hand shook so badly she almost knocked it off the counter. She clutched it in her fist, feeling the metal bite into her palm, using the pain to keep from screaming. There's a way station about 12 miles south, Arthur Brennan said quietly, not meeting her eyes. If you leave now, you might make it before the storm hits. It was a lie. They both knew it was a lie. 12 miles in a failing wagon with 3 exhausted children and a blizzard coming, they'd be dead before they made it halfway. But it was the kind of lie that let people sleep at night. The kind that said they'd tried to help, that they'd offered something, that whatever happened next wasn't their fault. Evelyn didn't call him on it. There was no point. She walked to the door. Her legs felt like wood, stiff and unresponsive. Behind her, the store remained silent. No one called her back. No one offered food for the boys, or a blanket, or even a word of genuine sympathy. The bell jingled again as she opened the door. The sound was still cheerful, still mocking. Mrs. Hart. She turned. Mayor Cole was watching her from beside the stove, his face thoughtful. I truly am sorry about your circumstances, he said. But you should know. If you're thinking about staying in Raven's Fork anyway, trying to camp somewhere on the outskirts, waiting for charity, don't. I'll have Sheriff Morrison move you along. This town doesn't need the burden of burying your family when you freeze to death on our land. Better it happens somewhere else. He said it kindly. That was the worst part. He genuinely believed he was being helpful, offering advice that might save her trouble down the road. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. She wanted to spit at his feet, to curse him, to tell him that someday he'd face judgment for this moment. But she was too tired, and her boys were waiting, and words had never changed anything anyway. She stepped out into the cold. The wagon was where she'd left it, tied to the hitching post outside the store. It wasn't really a wagon anymore, more like the skeleton of one, held together with rope and prayer. One wheel was cracked, another was missing half its spokes. The canvas cover had torn away somewhere in Nebraska, and the bed was empty except for 3 small bodies huddled together under a single blanket. Samuel, Caleb, and Joseph looked up as she approached. Their faces were pinched with cold and hunger, their lips blue, their eyes too large in their thin faces. But they didn't complain. They'd learned months ago that complaining didn't help. "Did they say yes, Mama?" Samuel, the oldest, asked. His voice was hoarse from the cough he'd had for 2 weeks. Evelyn climbed onto the wagon bench. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely gather the reins. "We're going to the way station," she heard herself say. "It's not far. We'll be warm soon." Another lie. She was becoming good at those. Samuel's face fell, but he didn't argue. He was 8 years old and already understood how the world worked. He pulled his brothers closer under the blanket and didn't ask any more questions. Evelyn clicked to the horse, a broken-down mare she'd traded for in Kansas, the last thing of value she'd had before the ring. The animal was as exhausted as they were, its ribs showing through its dull coat, but it leaned into the harness and pulled. The wagon creaked forward. Behind her, Raven's Fork continued its Christmas Eve celebration. Through the lit windows of the store, she could see people laughing, talking, returning to their shopping. The encounter with the desperate widow was already forgotten, just another unpleasant moment on what was otherwise a perfectly nice evening. The wind hit them as soon as they left the shelter of the buildings. It was a living thing, hungry and searching, looking for any gap in their defenses. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees in the past hour. The sky was the color of old iron, pressing down like a coffin lid. Evelyn turned the wagon south toward the fictional way station that didn't exist. She'd gone maybe a quarter mile when she pulled the horse to a stop. She couldn't do it. She couldn't drive her children toward a lie, couldn't pretend there was hope in that direction when she knew there was none. But she also couldn't go back to town. The mayor had been clear about that, which left only one option. Evelyn turned in her seat, looking up at the mountains that rose behind Raven's Fork like a wall of frozen granite. They were called the Devil's Spine, and the name fit. Jagged peaks, sheer cliffs, avalanche paths carved through forests of dead pine. Nobody went up there except miners chasing played-out claims, and most of them never came back down. But she'd heard rumors. Everyone had heard rumors. There was a man up there, a mountain man living alone somewhere above the tree line. The stories varied. Some said he was a deserter from the war, others that he'd murdered his family and fled civilization. Some claimed he was more animal than human now, that he ate raw meat and spoke only in grunts. The one thing everyone agreed on, Rowan Pike was dangerous, unpredictable, and best avoided. But he was also, allegedly, still alive, which meant he had shelter, which meant he'd found some way to survive where no one else could. It wasn't much of a hope. It was barely a hope at all. But it was more than the mayor had given her. Evelyn turned the wagon north toward the mountains. The horse balked, sensing something wrong in that direction, but she snapped the reins and the animal reluctantly obeyed. "Mama?" Caleb's voice was small, confused. "The man said the station was south." "I know, baby." Evelyn kept her eyes on the darkening trail ahead. "But I heard about another place. Closer. We're going there instead." "Is it warm?" Joseph, the youngest, asked. His teeth were chattering so hard he could barely speak. "Yes." Evelyn forced confidence into her voice. "It's warm and safe. We just have to be brave a little longer." More lies. She was drowning in them now. The trail climbed. Within 20 minutes, they were beyond the last of the scattered homesteads that marked Raven's Fork's outskirts. Within an hour, they were in true wilderness. Rocky slopes covered in snow, twisted pines clawing at the sky, silence broken only by the wind and the creak of the failing wagon. The storm hit at dusk. One moment, the air was merely cold and still. The next, the world exploded into white chaos. Snow came horizontally, driven by wind that screamed like 1,000 tortured voices. Visibility dropped to nothing. The temperature plunged so fast that Evelyn felt the moisture in her nose freeze solid. The horse stopped. It planted its feet and refused to move no matter how much Evelyn pleaded or snapped the reins. "Samuel!" She had to shout to be heard over the wind. "Take your brothers! Get under the wagon!" The boys scrambled out from under their blanket, fighting the wind that tried to tear them away. They crawled beneath the wagon bed, huddling against the wheels for whatever pathetic shelter they offered. Evelyn jumped down, leading the horse off the trail. There, a stand of pines, branches heavy with snow, forming a kind of natural wall. She tied the animal to the strongest trunk, then crawled under the wagon with her sons. They pressed together in the darkness, 3 small bodies and 1 thin woman, sharing warmth that was already fading. Above them, the storm raged. Snow began to pile against the wagon, building a wall that would either shelter them or bury them. It was impossible to know which. Joseph was crying, though the sound was nearly lost in the wind. Caleb had his eyes closed, his lips moving in a prayer their father had taught them before everything fell apart. Samuel just stared into the darkness, his arm around his youngest brother, his face set in an expression too old for an 8-year-old. Evelyn held them all, her own body wrapped around theirs, trying to be a wall between them and the cold. She was failing. She could feel it in the way her fingers had gone numb, the way her thoughts were starting to drift and scatter. This was how it ended then. Not with the bandits who'd taken everything in Missouri, not with the fever that had almost claimed Caleb in Kansas, not with starvation or exhaustion or any of the 100 other deaths they'd narrowly avoided. They would simply freeze. The storm would cover them like a blanket, and by morning they'd be statues of ice locked in a final embrace. At least they'd be together. At least the boys wouldn't be alone. Evelyn closed her eyes. She was so tired. Tired of fighting, tired of failing, tired of watching her children suffer for choices she and Thomas had made. Maybe this was mercy. Maybe this was the universe finally taking pity on them and ending the struggle. She felt herself drifting. The cold didn't hurt anymore. That was supposedly a good sign. It meant the end was close. And then she heard it. Footsteps. Not human footsteps. Too heavy, too deliberate. They crunched through the snow with a weight that suggested something massive, something that didn't care about the storm or the cold or the darkness. Evelyn's eyes snapped open. She tried to move, to put herself between her children and whatever was coming, but her body wouldn't respond. The cold had locked her joints, turned her muscles to stone. A shape emerged from the white chaos. It was huge, well over 6 feet, broad-shouldered, wrapped in furs that made it look even larger. For a moment, backlit by the storm, it looked like a bear walking upright. Then it crouched down, and she saw the face. It was human. Barely. Weathered skin stretched over brutal bone structure, a wild beard matted with ice, eyes that caught what little light existed and threw it back like an animal's. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, puckering the skin, pulling one corner of his mouth into a permanent sneer. He looked at Evelyn, then at the boys, then back at Evelyn. When he spoke, his voice was rough from disuse, each word forced out like he'd forgotten how to shape them. "You're dying!" It wasn't a question. It was a simple statement of fact, delivered with no more emotion than if he'd been commenting on the weather. Evelyn tried to respond, but her jaw wouldn't work. She managed a nod. The mountain man studied her for another moment. Then he reached under the wagon and grabbed Samuel by the collar of his coat, dragging him out into the storm like a sack of grain. "No!" The word finally tore free from Evelyn's throat. "Don't, please." He ignored her. He pulled Caleb out next, then Joseph, who was so cold he didn't even cry when rough hands seized him. The man bundled all 3 boys against his chest with one arm, holding them like they weighed nothing. Then he reached back for Evelyn. "Can you walk?" His face was inches from hers, his breath hot against her frozen skin. She shook her head. She could barely feel her legs. He grunted. It might have been annoyance or it might have been amusement. She couldn't tell. Then he grabbed the back of her dress and hauled her out from under the wagon with his free hand. The strength was inhuman. He lifted her and the boys like they were made of paper, like the storm and the cold and the darkness were nothing but minor inconveniences. He looked her in the eyes one more time. His face was expressionless, but something moved in those animal eyes. Not kindness, exactly, but a kind of grim recognition. He'd seen death coming for them and had decided, for reasons known only to himself, that it wouldn't have them tonight. "Walk," he said, "or die." Then he turned and started walking into the storm, carrying her children away. Evelyn had perhaps 5 seconds to make a choice. She could stay here, under the wagon, and let the cold take her. Part of her wanted that, wanted rest, wanted the struggle to be over. But the boys were walking away from her, disappearing into the white chaos in the arms of a monster the whole town feared. She forced her legs to move. They barely responded, but she got them under her, got herself upright. Each step was agony. The cold had settled into her bones, and movement felt like shattering glass. But she followed. Because that's what mothers did. They followed their children into the darkness, into the unknown, into the arms of monsters, because the alternative was unthinkable. The mountain man didn't look back to see if she was coming. He simply walked, his massive frame cutting through the storm like a ship through waves. Evelyn stumbled after him, falling twice, getting up twice, driven by nothing but the shapes of her sons barely visible ahead. She lost track of time. It might have been 20 minutes or 2 hours. The world had contracted to a single point of focus. Keep moving, don't lose sight of him, don't let the darkness take you. And then, impossibly, there was light ahead. The mountain man stopped at the mouth of a cave, a crack in the granite face barely wide enough for his shoulders. He ducked inside, still carrying the boys, and disappeared. Evelyn reached the opening moments later and nearly collapsed with relief at the absence of wind. She crawled inside through a narrow passage that opened into a larger space. It was a cave, but not a natural one. Someone had worked this space, expanded it, shaped it. The ceiling was 8 feet high, supported by timber beams. The floor had been leveled and covered with pine needles and dried moss. And against one wall, a fire burned in a stone hearth with a chimney carved through the rock above. The heat was overwhelming. After hours in the killing cold, it felt like standing too close to a forge. Evelyn's skin burned where the warmth touched it. The mountain man set the boys down near the fire. They huddled together, not speaking, their eyes huge in their thin faces. He pointed to a pile of furs in the corner. "Sit. Don't move. Don't touch anything." His voice was a command, not a suggestion. The boys obeyed immediately, crawling to the furs and burrowing into them like small animals seeking shelter. The man turned to Evelyn. Up close, in the firelight, he was even more frightening than he'd been in the storm. The scar was worse than she'd thought. The tissue puckered and discolored, suggesting a wound that had healed badly without medical care. His hands were massive, scarred across the knuckles, the hands of someone who'd spent years doing violence to survive. He studied her with those animal eyes, and she had the disturbing sense that he was cataloging her injuries, assessing her value, deciding if the effort of saving them had been worth it. "You're bleeding," he said finally. Evelyn looked down. She hadn't noticed, but her hands were cut in a dozen places from clawing through the snow. Blood dripped onto the clean floor of the cave. Her voice came out as a croak. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to—" He turned away before she could finish, moving to a shelf carved into the wall. He pulled down a leather bag and brought it back, kneeling in front of her with a grace that seemed wrong for someone his size. "Give me your hands." It wasn't a request. Evelyn extended her shaking hands, and he took them in his own. His grip was careful, controlled, the same way someone might handle a wounded bird. He cleaned the cuts with water from a clay jar, his movements efficient and practiced. Then he wrapped them in strips of clean cloth, tying off the bandages with knots that wouldn't slip. "Thank you," Evelyn whispered, "for saving us, for bringing us here. We would have died if— You're still dying." He released her hands and sat back on his heels. "Frostbite in the toes, probably the fingers too. Possible pneumonia in the youngest, starvation in all of you. You've got maybe 3 days before something kills you anyway." He said it the same way he'd said everything else, flat, factual, without emotion. Evelyn stared at him. Then why did you bring us here? For the first time, something shifted in his expression. It wasn't quite a smile. His face didn't seem capable of that anymore, but the corners of his eyes tightened slightly. Storm's still out there, he said. Would have been cruel to make you die cold. He stood up and moved to the fire, adding wood from a neatly stacked pile. The flames jumped higher, filling the cave with dancing light. Evelyn looked at her sons. They were watching the mountain man with a mixture of fear and fascination, too exhausted to run, too cold to care about the danger. Joseph had fallen asleep already, his head on Samuel's shoulder. Caleb's eyes were closing despite his obvious effort to stay alert. "What's your name?" she asked quietly. The man didn't turn around. "Doesn't matter. It matters to me. You saved our lives. I'd like to know who to thank." He was silent for so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, still facing the fire, he spoke. Rowan Pike." The name hung in the air between them. Evelyn waited for more. An explanation, a story, something to explain why a man who supposedly murdered his family was showing them mercy now. But he said nothing else. He simply sat by the fire, feeding it, keeping it alive, while outside the storm raged and somewhere far below, in the warm general store in Raven's Fork, people celebrated Christmas Eve and slept soundly in their beds, certain they'd made the right choice. Evelyn woke to the smell of meat cooking and the sound of her son's whispering. For a moment, disoriented by warmth and the absence of wind, she thought she was back in their house in Cincinnati, before Thomas lost his job, before everything collapsed. Then her body reminded her where she was. Every muscle ached, her hands throbbed beneath the bandages, and her feet felt like blocks of wood wrapped in fire. She opened her eyes. The cave was brighter than it had been, morning light filtering through the entrance passage. The fire still burned, tended by someone who knew how to make flames last through a long night. And crouched beside it, turning a spit with 3 rabbits skewered on it, was Rowan Pike. In the daylight, he was somehow both more and less frightening than he'd been in the storm. Less, because he was clearly human, just a man, scarred and weathered, but a man nonetheless. More, because the light revealed details she'd missed in the darkness. The way his shoulders moved suggested old injuries that had healed wrong. His hands bore scars that looked like burns, cuts, and worse things she couldn't identify. And when he turned slightly, she saw that the scar on his face continued down his neck, disappearing beneath his shirt. Samuel, Caleb, and Joseph sat near him, close enough to the fire to be warm, but far enough from the mountain man to flee if necessary. They were watching him cook with the intensity of starving children who'd learned not to beg but couldn't stop hoping. Rowan looked up and met Evelyn's eyes. "You're awake. How long did I sleep?" 12 hours, give or take." He pulled the spit from the fire and examined the rabbits with a critical eye. "Boys have been up for 2, haven't moved from that spot, haven't asked for food. You trained them that way, or did life do it?" The question was too direct, too knowing. Evelyn sat up slowly, pain shooting through her shoulders. "Both, I suppose," Rowan grunted. He used a knife to cut the first rabbit from the spit, placed it on a flat piece of slate, and set it in front of the boys. "Eat! Don't burn your mouths!" Samuel looked at his mother, asking silent permission. When she nodded, all 3 boys fell on the meat like wolves. They tore at it with their hands, too hungry for manners, grease running down their chins. Joseph made a sound that was half sob, half moan, the sound of someone who'd forgotten what being full felt like. Rowan cut the second rabbit and brought it to Evelyn. She wanted to refuse, wanted to save it for the boys, but her stomach betrayed her with a growl so loud it echoed off the cave walls. "Eat," Rowan said. It was the same command he'd given her sons, flat and non-negotiable. "You're no good to them dead." The rabbit was perfectly cooked, the meat falling off the bone, seasoned with nothing but smoke and salt. Evelyn ate slowly, forcing herself not to devour it, knowing that her stomach had shrunk and too much too fast would make her sick. But it took every ounce of willpower she had. Rowan kept the third rabbit for himself. He ate methodically, efficiently, his eyes moving between Evelyn and the boys like he was still assessing, still deciding if saving them had been a mistake. When the meal was finished and the bones had been tossed into the fire, he stood and moved to the back of the cave. He returned with 4 pairs of socks, thick wool, hand-knitted, surprisingly clean. "Take off your boots," he told the boys. They obeyed, struggling with frozen laces. When their feet emerged, Evelyn bit back a gasp. All 3 had toes that were white and waxy, the tissue damage obvious even to her untrained eye. Rowan examined each foot with the same clinical detachment he'd shown the night before. His hands were surprisingly gentle as he probed the damaged tissue, checking for sensation, assessing the extent of the injury. "You're lucky," he said finally. "Another hour, and you'd be losing toes. As it is, you'll keep them, but they'll hurt like hell for the next week." He handed each boy a pair of socks. "Put these on. Keep them on. Don't get them wet." "Thank you, sir," Samuel said quietly, his voice hoarse from coughing. Rowan's eyes snapped to him. "Don't call me sir. I'm not your father, and I'm not a gentleman. Name's Rowan. Use it or use nothing." Samuel nodded, his face flushing. Rowan turned to Evelyn and tossed her the 4th pair of socks. "You too. Let me see the damage." Evelyn hesitated. The intimacy of removing her boots in front of a strange man felt wrong, even in circumstances like these. But the pain in her feet was getting worse, not better, and she could feel the wrongness in her toes. She unlaced Thomas's cut-down boots and pulled them off. Her feet were worse than the boys. More white tissue, more swelling, blisters forming where the leather had rubbed. Rowan examined them with the same impersonal efficiency. "Frostbite, 2nd degree. Could be worse. Could be better." He stood and returned to his supplies, coming back with a tin of something that smelled like pine tar and mint. "This'll hurt. Don't scream. You'll scare the boys." He wasn't exaggerating. When he applied the salve to her damaged skin, Evelyn had to bite her lip hard enough to draw blood to keep from crying out. It felt like her feet were on fire, every nerve screaming protest. But after the initial agony faded, there was relief. The throbbing eased. The wrongness receded slightly. Rowan wrapped her feet in clean cloth, then handed her the socks. "Stay off them for 3 days minimum. Longer if you can." "We don't have 3 days." Evelyn's voice was steadier than she felt. "The storm will pass. We'll need to move on. Find somewhere." "Where?" Rowan interrupted. He sat back on his heels, watching her with those unsettling eyes. "Back to Raven's Fork? The mayor made it clear you're not welcome. South to the way station that doesn't exist? North into higher mountains where the cold will finish what it started? Exactly where do you think you're going, Mrs. Hart?" The use of her name startled her. "How did you know?" "Heard about you in town 2 days ago." He stood and moved back to the fire, adding wood with practiced efficiency. "Widow woman with 3 boys, husband died a thief, traveling alone. The gossip made it up the mountain before you did. Always does." "You go to town?" Caleb asked, surprised enough to forget his fear. "Once a month. Trade furs for supplies." Rowan didn't look at the boy, his attention on the fire. "Town tolerates me because I bring them what they need and leave before I cause problems. We have an understanding." "Then you could ask them to help us," Joseph said, his voice small and hopeful. "You could tell them we're nice, that we won't cause trouble, and they'd tell you the same thing they told your mother." Rowan's voice was flat. "Raven's Fork doesn't forgive. Doesn't matter if you're nice or quiet or deserving. Your father's crime stained you. That stain doesn't wash off." The casual cruelty of it made Evelyn's chest tight. "He made one mistake, one desperate choice to save our son, and it cost him everything. How is that justice?" "It's not." Rowan turned to look at her, and for the first time she saw something in his expression that might have been sympathy. "It's just how people are. They need someone to punish, someone to look down on, someone who's worse than them, makes them feel better about their own sins. Your husband gave them that. You and your boys are paying for it." "You sound like you speak from experience." Something shuddered in Rowan's face. "Everyone up here speaks from experience. That's why we're up here." The conversation died. Evelyn wanted to press, wanted to know what had driven this man into exile. But the wall he'd thrown up was solid and high. Instead, she watched as he moved through the cave, tending to tasks that spoke of years of solitary survival. He had shelves carved into the walls stocked with preserved food, dried meat, smoked fish, jars of what looked like berries and roots. Tools hung from pegs, each one clean and well-maintained. Furs were stretched on frames, curing in the dry cave air. Everything had a place, a purpose, a system. This wasn't a man hiding from the world. This was a man who'd built a new world and learned to thrive in it. "The storm's still going," Rowan said, breaking the silence. "Won't stop until tomorrow, maybe longer. You're stuck here until it does." "We don't want to impose, Evelyn started. "You're already imposing." He said it without heat, just stating facts. "Question is whether you survive the imposition. I've got food for maybe 5 more days if we're careful. Water's not a problem, there's a spring in the back tunnel. Heat's fine as long as the wood holds out." "And after 5 days?" Rowan was silent for a moment, his back to her. When he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "After 5 days, we figure out what comes next. But right now, you need to heal. Boys need to eat. Storm needs to pass. One problem at a time." It was the closest thing to kindness he'd offered. Evelyn took it for what it was, not a promise, but a reprieve. The day passed slowly. The boys, exhausted from weeks of travel and deprivation, slept most of it away, curled together in the pile of furs like puppies. Evelyn tried to stay awake, hyper-alert to any threat this strange man might pose, but her body betrayed her. She drifted in and out of sleep, waking periodically to find Rowan in different parts of the cave, mending a tear in his coat, sharpening a knife, reading a book so worn the cover had fallen off. The third time she woke, it was dark outside again, and he was cooking something that smelled like herbs and meat. "What is that?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. "Stew. Got root vegetables stored in the cold room, some dried venison. Figured the boys need more than just meat." He stirred the pot hanging over the fire. "You know how to cook?" "I used to when we had a kitchen and food." "Can you sew?" "Yes. Why?" He pulled something from beside him, a shirt with a torn sleeve. "Because I can't, and I've got 6 months of mending piled up that I've been ignoring." It was such a normal request, so domestic, that Evelyn almost laughed. Here she was, trapped in a cave with a man the whole town feared, and he wanted her to sew. "I can do that," she said, "if you have needle and thread." He did. Of course he did. Everything in this cave was organized, prepared, ready for any need. He brought her a small wooden box filled with needles, thread, and even a thimble. Evelyn took the shirt and began working on the tear. Her hands were clumsy with the bandages, but the familiar motion was soothing. She'd spent years mending clothes, making one set of garments last through season after season of wear. This was something she knew how to do, something she was good at. Rowan watched her work for a moment, then returned to his stew. "Your husband," he said quietly, not looking at her. "The money he took. Did he steal it?" Evelyn's hands stilled. "Does it matter?" "Maybe. Maybe not. But I'd like to know who I'm sheltering." She considered lying, but this man had saved their lives, had shared his food and fire, had tended their injuries. He deserved the truth. "Yes," she said. "He took it. $2,000 from the railroad payroll. He was going to return it within 48 hours before anyone noticed, but the auditor came early." Thomas panicked. He tried to explain, but it looked exactly like what it was: theft. They arrested him, posted bail, and 3 weeks later, he couldn't live with the shame. He walked into the river and didn't walk out. Her voice didn't break. She'd told this story enough times that it had become a recitation, the emotional weight stripped away. Why'd he need the money? Joseph was sick, pneumonia. The doctors wanted $50 up front for treatment, another $100 for the hospital. We didn't have it. Thomas had already borrowed from everyone he could. The railroad was his last option. Did the money save him? Evelyn looked at her youngest son, sleeping peacefully by the fire, his color better than it had been in weeks. Yes, Joseph lived. Thomas died. I'm still not sure if that was the right trade. Rowan was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Your husband did what any father would do. Town's wrong to punish you for it." "They're not punishing us for what he did. They're punishing us for what he was. poor, desperate, and inconvenient. If he'd been rich, they would have called it a loan. If he'd been powerful, they would have called it a mistake. But he was just a railroad engineer with a sick son, so they called it theft. True enough. Rowan ladled stew into wooden bowls. Still doesn't explain why you came up here. Plenty of towns between Cincinnati and Raven's Fork. Why keep going until you hit the one that would kill you? Evelyn finished the repair and set the shirt aside. We weren't going to Raven's Fork specifically. We were just going west, following rumors of work, towns that needed seamstresses or cooks or laundresses. But everywhere we stopped, someone recognized Thomas's name. Word travels. Telegraph lines carry gossip faster than wagons carry people. By the time we reached Kansas, we were running out of places that hadn't heard the story. So you thought you'd try the edge of nowhere. I thought I'd try somewhere small enough that they might not know, might not care. She laughed, a bitter sound. I was wrong. Rowan woke the boys and handed out bowls of stew. They ate slowly this time, their stomachs adjusting to regular food. When they finished, he collected the bowls and cleaned them with sand and water, his movements methodical. Tell me about the wagon, he said as he worked. It was barely holding together when I found you. How long has it been like that? Since Nebraska. We hit a boulder fording a river, cracked the axle, broke a wheel. I patched it as best I could, but I'm not a wheelwright. And the horse? Traded for her in Kansas. She was old then. She's worse now. Rowan dried the bowls and stacked them on a shelf. The wagon's not going to make it down the mountain. Even if we could fix it, the trail's too rough, and the horse won't survive another week of hard travel. I know. Evelyn had known it for days, but hadn't wanted to face it. I just didn't know what else to do. If we stopped, we'd starve. If we kept going, we'd die. I chose to keep going because at least that felt like trying. You should have stopped in the last town, found work, built up some reserves. I tried. They found out who I was within 3 days. We had to leave in the middle of the night before someone decided to make an example of us. Rowan turned to look at her, his scarred face thoughtful. They tried to hurt you? They tried to hurt my sons, called them thieves' spawn, threw rocks. The sheriff told us to leave, said he couldn't guarantee our safety if we stayed. Something dangerous flickered in Rowan's eyes. The sheriff said that. Not everyone wears a badge because they believe in justice. No. Rowan's voice was quiet, but there was steel beneath it. They don't. The boys were falling asleep again, their bodies demanding rest to heal. Evelyn covered them with furs, tucking them in like she used to when they had a home and beds and futures. When she turned back, Rowan was standing near the cave entrance, looking out at the storm. Snow still fell in sheets, visible even in the darkness. Can I ask you something? Evelyn said. He didn't turn. You can ask. Doesn't mean I'll answer. Why did you save us? You don't know us. We're nothing to you. You could have left us under that wagon and no one would have blamed you, so why bring us here? For a long time, Rowan was silent. The wind howled outside and the fire crackled, and Evelyn thought he wasn't going to respond at all. Then he spoke, his voice so low she had to strain to hear it. Because I've been where you are. Different reasons, different circumstances, but I've been the one everyone rejected. I've been the one left to die in the cold. And someone saved me when they didn't have to. I'm just passing it forward. Who saved you? Doesn't matter. They're dead now. The finality in his tone killed any further questions. Evelyn returned to the fire and sat down, her mind churning. This man was a contradiction. Brutal and gentle, isolated and generous, feared and kind. The town had made him a monster in their stories, but the reality was far more complicated. The storm continued through the night and into the next day. By the second morning, the cave felt smaller, the walls pressing in. The boys were restless, tired of confinement, their energy returning faster than their judgment. They wanted to explore, to run, to do anything but sit still. Rowan tolerated it for about an hour. Then he stood, pulled on his heavy coat, and jerked his head toward the back of the cave. Come on, I'll show you the spring, but you listen to everything I say, and you don't touch anything without permission. Understood? The boys nodded eagerly. Even Samuel, usually so cautious, looked excited. They followed Rowan through a narrow passage Evelyn hadn't noticed before. It twisted deeper into the mountain, lit by a lantern Rowan carried. The walls were close enough to touch on both sides, and the ceiling dropped low enough that Rowan had to duck. After 50 feet, the passage opened into another chamber, smaller than the first, but no less impressive. Water trickled from a crack in the wall, filling a natural basin before draining away through a gap in the floor. The sound was musical, peaceful, nothing like the screaming wind outside. Spring never freezes, Rowan said, comes from deep enough that the mountain's heat keeps it liquid. Water's clean. I've been drinking it for 5 years without problems. Joseph reached out to touch the water. It's warm. Warmer than snow, anyway. You can drink straight from the basin, but use this. He handed Joseph a wooden cup hanging from a peg. Don't put your whole head in. Don't piss in it. Don't do anything that might contaminate it. This is what keeps me alive up here. The boys took turns drinking, their faces awed by the simple miracle of clean water appearing from stone. While they explored the chamber under Rowan's watchful eye, Evelyn noticed something else. Shelves carved into the walls filled with books. Dozens of them, leather-bound and cloth-covered, some new, some ancient. You read, she said, surprised. Surprised the savage can read? There was amusement in his voice, the first she'd heard. Surprised anyone living alone in a cave has this many books. What else am I going to do during the winter? I can only skin so many animals before I go crazy. He pulled one down and handed it to her. Shakespeare. The town doctor was throwing them out when his father died. I traded furs for the lot. Evelyn opened the book. The Tempest. The pages were worn but cared for, the margins filled with notes in cramped handwriting. You annotate Shakespeare. I annotate everything. If I'm going to read it, I'm going to think about it. Otherwise, what's the point? She looked at him with new eyes. This wasn't a man who descended into savagery. This was a man who deliberately built a life here, who'd filled his isolation with knowledge and purpose. Who were you? She asked quietly. Before the mountain? Rowan's expression closed down. Someone different, someone worse. He took the book from her hands and returned it to the shelf. That person's gone. This is what's left. He wouldn't say more, but as they walked back through the passage, Evelyn caught him looking at her sons with an expression that was almost hunger, not threatening, but yearning. The look of someone who'd lost something precious and saw echoes of it in front of him. By the third day, the storm had weakened, but not broken. Snow still fell, but the wind had dropped enough that the world outside was visible again. Rowan took them to the cave entrance and pointed down the mountain. See that line of trees? That's where the wagon trail is. It's buried under 8 feet of snow right now. Even when the storm passes, it'll take 3 days minimum for the drifts to settle enough to travel. And then? Evelyn asked. And then we figure out what you're going to do, because you can't stay here forever, and you can't go back to Raven's Fork, and you can't keep traveling with a broken wagon and a dying horse. You make it sound like we're trapped. You are trapped. The mountains trapped you. Your husband's crimes trapped you. Winter's trapped you. Question is whether you're going to die trapped or find a way out. It should have been harsh. It should have felt cruel. But Rowan said it with the same factual tone he used for everything. Not judgment, just observation. That night, after the boys had fallen asleep, Evelyn and Rowan sat by the fire. She'd finished mending all his damaged clothes and had started on his spare blanket, repairing holes and worn patches. You're good at that, he said, watching her work. I've had practice. When you can't afford new clothes, you learn to make old ones last. Could you teach it? Teach sewing, of course. It's not difficult, just patience and... She stopped, realizing what he was really asking. You think I should stay, set up somewhere and teach sewing? I think you're good at something useful, and useful things can earn money. Not much, maybe, but enough to feed your boys. Enough to build a foundation. Where? Every town we've tried has not Raven's Fork, not the towns you've already been to, but there are mining camps north of here, over the divide. Smaller operations, men who've got no use for town politics because they're barely part of civilization themselves. Some of them have families. Women who'd pay for someone to teach them better sewing, better cooking, better anything that makes life up there more bearable. Evelyn considered it. Mining camps are dangerous, lawless. So is the trail, so is starving. Pick your danger. He poked the fire. I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm saying it's possible. And possible is better than dead. She wanted to argue, to find the flaw in his logic, but she couldn't. He was right. The boys couldn't survive another month of running. They needed stability, safety, food. They needed a place to rest before winter killed them. I'll think about it, she said finally. Don't think too long. Weather breaks in 3 days. You've got maybe 2 weeks before the next storm. If you're going to move, you do it in that window or you're stuck here until spring. The warning was clear. Rowan would shelter them through this storm, but he wasn't offering permanent sanctuary. He had his own survival to think about, his own carefully balanced system. They were an intrusion, a temporary one, maybe even a welcome one, but temporary nonetheless. On the 4th day, the storm finally broke. The wind died to nothing, and when Evelyn woke, sunlight was streaming through the cave entrance for the first time since they'd arrived. Rowan was already up, standing at the entrance, looking down the mountain. Something in his posture made her nervous. "What's wrong?" she asked, joining him. He pointed. Far below, barely visible through the trees, was movement. Too organized to be animals. Too purposeful to be chance. "Someone's coming up the mountain," he said. 2 men, maybe 3. They've been climbing for an hour. Who would... Evelyn's blood went cold. "The mayor. He said he'd have the sheriff move us along if we stayed near town." "They don't know you're here. The wagon's buried under 10 feet of snow, half a mile away. There's no trail to this cave." But Rowan's hand had moved to the long knife at his belt. "Still, better to be ready." He turned to Evelyn. "Take the boys to the spring room. Stay there until I come get you. Don't make noise. Don't come out." "You think they're dangerous?" "I think men who climb a mountain in winter weather have a reason, and reasons usually involve violence." He pulled a second knife from his boot and handed it to her. "You know how to use this?" Evelyn took it, the weight foreign in her hand. "I've never... Hold it like this." He adjusted her grip. "If someone comes at you, don't swing wide. Short, hard thrust into the belly or throat. Don't hesitate. Hesitation gets you killed." "You sound like you've done this before." "I have. That's why you should listen." He gave her a push toward the back passage. "Go, now." Evelyn gathered the boys, who sensed the urgency and didn't argue. They crowded into the spring room, and she pushed them into the darkest corner, away from the entrance. "Stay quiet," she whispered. "No matter what you hear, stay quiet." Through the narrow passage, she could hear voices, rough, male, echoing off the cave walls. They'd reached the entrance. "Pike, we know you're in there. Come out where we can see you." Rowan's response was calm, unhurried. "You're on my land. Leave." "Your land?" The voice laughed. "This is public mountain. Nobody owns it, especially not a murdering hermit who—" The sound of a scuffle, a grunt, something heavy hitting stone. Evelyn's heart hammered. She clutched the knife, positioned herself between her sons and the passage entrance, and waited. The silence that followed the scuffle lasted 3 heartbeats. Then Rowan's voice cut through the cave, cold and final. "Next man who steps through that entrance doesn't walk back out." Big talk for someone outnumbered. A different voice this time, younger, cocky. "Mayor Cole sent us to make sure you understand the situation. The widow and her brats aren't welcome in Raven's Fork. If you're hiding them, you're making an enemy of the whole town." Evelyn's breath caught. They knew. Somehow, they knew she was here. "I'm not hiding anyone," Rowan said. His voice hadn't changed, still flat and emotionless. "And even if I was, Cole doesn't give orders on this mountain. Tell him to send his threat somewhere that gives a damn." "You think you're untouchable up here?" The first voice again, older, meaner. "You think we can't burn you out? Smoke you out like a badger from a hole?" "You could try." There was something in Rowan's tone now, something that made Evelyn's skin prickle. "But fire's unpredictable. Smoke rises. And I know 17 ways out of this cave. You know one. Do the mathematics." A pause. Evelyn could picture them weighing their options, trying to decide if their mission was worth dying for. "The mayor doesn't forget debts, Pike. You help that woman. You make yourself his problem. And his problems have a way of getting solved. Then tell the mayor to come solve it himself instead of sending boys to do his threatening." "You arrogant son of a—" The sound of movement, fast and violent, a cry of pain, something metal hitting stone and skittering across the cave floor. Then Rowan's voice again, closer to the entrance now. "Get off my mountain. Don't come back. And tell Cole that if he wants to talk to me about the widow, he can climb up here himself and do it to my face." More footsteps, retreating this time. Voices arguing in harsh whispers, then silence. Evelyn counted to 100 before she dared to move. When she finally emerged from the spring room, knife still clutched in her trembling hand, Rowan was standing in the main chamber cleaning his own blade with a strip of cloth. There was blood on the stone floor near the entrance, a trail of it leading outside. "Are they gone?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "For now." He didn't look up from his knife. "They'll be back. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but they'll be back. Cole doesn't like being told no." "How did they know we were here?" "They didn't, not for certain." He finished cleaning the blade and slid it back into its sheath. "But they suspected. Someone probably saw your wagon tracks before the storm covered them. Or maybe they just assumed the only place a desperate woman would go is toward the one man crazy enough to help her." Evelyn felt her legs weaken. She sank down onto a pile of furs, the knife falling from her numb fingers. "I've brought trouble to your door." "I'm sorry. We'll leave as soon as—" "You'll leave when I say you can leave." Rowan's voice was sharp. "Right now, you'd last maybe 6 hours before they found you. And when they find you, they won't just turn you away this time. They'll make an example of you, show everyone what happens to people who defy the mayor." "Why?" The word burst out of her, raw with frustration and fear. "Why does he care so much? We're nobody. We're nothing to him. Why waste the effort hunting us down?" Rowan was quiet for a moment. Then he moved to one of his shelves and pulled down a bottle of amber liquid. He poured 2 fingers into a wooden cup and handed it to her. "Drink. You're shaking." Evelyn took it. The whiskey burned going down, but it steadied something inside her. When she looked up, Rowan was watching her with those unsettling eyes. "It's not about you," he said finally. "It's about control. Cole runs Raven's Fork because everyone's afraid to challenge him. He owns half the buildings, holds most of the debts, controls who gets supplies and who doesn't. But that control only works if people believe he's untouchable. If he lets you defy him, even accidentally, even by just surviving, it shows weakness. And weakness in a man like Cole is blood in the water. So this is about pride. It's about power. Pride's just the weapon." Rowan poured himself a drink and downed it in one swallow. "Your husband's crime gave Cole an excuse to exercise that power. He could reject you publicly, prove he was righteous, show everyone that he decides who belongs and who doesn't. You were supposed to die quietly, somewhere out of sight. Instead, you're alive and under my protection, which means Cole's authority has limits. He can't have that." The truth of it settled over Evelyn like a shroud. She'd been so focused on survival, on keeping her boys alive one more day, that she hadn't seen the larger game being played. She wasn't a person to these men. She was a piece on a board, moved and sacrificed according to rules she didn't understand. "What do we do?" she asked. "We?" Rowan raised an eyebrow. "You said they'll be back. That means this is your problem now, too. So what do we do?" He studied her for a long moment. Then he set down his cup and moved to a wooden chest in the corner of the cave. When he opened it, Evelyn saw papers inside, documents, letters, things that looked official and important. "Before we decide what to do," Rowan said slowly, "I need to know something. Your husband's coat, the one you're wearing, did he keep anything in the pockets? Papers, letters, anything like that?" Evelyn looked down at the heavy wool coat she'd wrapped around herself. It was too large, the sleeves hanging past her hands, but it was warm and it smelled faintly of Thomas. She'd been wearing it since the day he died. "I don't know. I never checked." "Why?" "Because men who kill themselves over shame often leave evidence of what shamed them. And evidence is leverage." He gestured to the coat. "Check." With shaking hands, Evelyn searched the pockets. The outer ones were empty except for a broken pipe and some tobacco she'd forgotten about. But the inner pocket, the one sewn into the lining, had something in it. She pulled out a folded packet of papers, yellow with age and water-stained but still legible. When she opened them, her breath stopped. They were ledgers. accounting records from the Ravens Fork Mining Company, and someone had gone through them with a pen, circling discrepancies, marking questionable entries, writing notes in the margins in Thomas's careful handwriting. "What is this?" she whispered. Rowan took the papers and scanned them quickly. His expression didn't change, but something dark flickered in his eyes. "This is why your husband died, and why Cole wants you dead too." He spread the papers out on the floor between them, pointing to the circled entries. "Your husband wasn't just a railroad engineer, was he?" "He was, before the war. But after he came back, the railroad wouldn't rehire him because of his injuries. He took work as a bookkeeper instead, wherever he could find it. And Ravens Fork hired him. For 3 months. Last spring. The mining company needed someone to sort out their accounts before the annual audit." Evelyn's mind was racing, connecting pieces she'd never put together. "He said the books were a mess, that whoever kept them before didn't know basic arithmetic. But when he tried to correct the errors, the company let him go. They said they couldn't afford to keep him on. They let him go because he found what they were hiding." Rowan's finger traced one of the marked entries. "Look at this. $3,000 paid to equipment maintenance in a month when no equipment was purchased. $5,000 for operational expenses with no itemization. $8,000 for contractor fees with no contractor names." He looked up at her. "These aren't errors. This is embezzlement. Someone was stealing from the mining company, covering it up with fake expenses. And your husband found proof." Evelyn felt the room spinning. "Mayor Cole, he owns the mining company. He owns 40%. Enough to control it." Rowan gathered the papers and tapped them against his palm. "But he's not the only investor. There are others, townspeople, investors from back east, people who'd care very much if they knew their money was being stolen. Your husband must have kept these as insurance, proof, in case Cole tried to silence him. But why didn't Thomas use them? Why didn't he expose Cole?" "Because Cole's smart. He waited until your husband had committed his own crime, stealing that payroll money. The moment Thomas took that cash, anything he said about Cole's embezzlement would look like a desperate man trying to deflect blame." "Who would believe a thief accusing a respected mayor?" Rowan's voice was grim. "Cole set the perfect trap. Your husband could either keep quiet about what he knew and face shame in prison, or speak up and be dismissed as a liar trying to save himself. Either way, he was destroyed. And it destroyed him." Evelyn's voice broke. The weight of knowing the truth but being unable to prove it, unable to defend himself, unable to protect his family from the consequences of his one desperate act, it was too much. So he walked into the river. Rowan set the papers down carefully. "These documents are dangerous, Mrs. Hart. They're proof that Cole is a thief and a fraud. They could destroy him if the right people saw them. But they're also your death warrant. As long as you have them, as long as Cole suspects you might, he has to eliminate you. You're not just an inconvenience anymore. You're a threat." The boys had crept out from the spring room during the conversation, drawn by the tension in the adults' voices. Samuel stood nearby, his young face pale and serious. "Mama," he said quietly, "are we going to die?" The question hung in the air. Evelyn wanted to lie, to comfort him, to promise that everything would be fine. But she'd done enough lying. Her son deserved the truth. "I don't know, baby," she said, "but we're going to fight, however we can, for as long as we can. We're going to fight." Rowan looked at her, then at the boys, then back at the papers on the floor. She could see him calculating, weighing options, running through scenarios in his mind. "There's a way," he said finally. "It's dangerous. It might get us all killed, but it's better than waiting for Cole to hunt you down." "What way?" "We make the truth public. We expose what Cole did. Show everyone in Ravens Fork that their beloved mayor is a thief who drove a good man to suicide to cover his crimes. We destroy his reputation before he can destroy you." "How? If Thomas couldn't make people listen when he was alive, why would they listen to me?" "Because you're not just going to tell them. You're going to show them. In a way they can't ignore, can't dismiss, can't pretend didn't happen." Rowan stood and moved to the cave entrance, looking down at the town far below. "The Founders' Ball. It's in 3 days. Every important person in Ravens Fork attends. Investors, businessmen, territorial officials. Cole hosts it every year to show off his wealth and influence. It's the perfect stage. You want me to confront him? Publicly? In front of the whole town? I want you to burn his world down. Rowan turned back to her, and there was something fierce in his expression now, something that looked almost like hope. We show up uninvited. We bring the evidence. We make him answer for what he's done in front of witnesses who matter, people who have money invested in his company, people who'll demand answers. We force the truth into the light where he can't hide it. They'll throw us out before we can say a word. Not if we do it right. Not if we have help. He was already planning. She could see it in his eyes. I know someone. My brother. We haven't spoken in 8 years, but he owes me. He lives beneath the mountains, works with explosives for the mining operations. If anyone can create a distraction big enough to get us into that ball, it's him. Your brother. Evelyn's voice was cautious. The one you haven't spoken to in 8 years. You think he'll help us? I think he'll help me, and right now that's the same thing. Rowan gathered the documents and tucked them carefully into his shirt. The question is whether you're brave enough to do this. Standing up in front of everyone who rejected you, who called your husband a thief and your son's criminal spawn, and demanding they face the truth. It won't be easy. It might not even work, but it's the only chance you have to end this. Evelyn looked at her sons. Samuel was watching her with those 2 old eyes, waiting for her decision. Caleb had his arm around Joseph, protective and afraid. They'd already survived so much. They deserved better than spending the rest of their lives running, hiding, looking over their shoulders. I'll do it, she said. Whatever it takes. I'll do it. Rowan nodded. Then we leave tonight. The path down is too dangerous in daylight. Cole's men will be watching. But I know trails they don't, ways through the forest that don't show up on any map. We get to my brother's place by dawn, convince him to help, and we have 2 days to plan before the ball. 2 days to plan the impossible. I've done worse with less time. He moved to his supplies and started pulling down items. Rope, blankets, food wrapped in cloth. Get the boys ready. Warm clothes, sturdy boots. We'll be moving fast and we can't stop if someone gets tired. The next hours passed in a blur of preparation. Rowan showed Evelyn how to pack efficiently, how to distribute weight so the boys could carry their share without being overburdened. He gave them each a walking stick he'd carved from mountain ash, strong enough to use as weapons if needed. As the sun set and darkness claimed the mountain, Rowan extinguished the fire and scattered the ashes. He covered the entrance with brush and stones, making it look like just another crack in the rock face. Within 20 minutes, there was no sign anyone had ever lived there. Won't they find it eventually? Evelyn asked. Eventually. But by then it won't matter. He shouldered his pack and pulled on his heavy coat. We come back here or we don't come back at all. They descended in single file, Rowan leading, the boys in the middle, Evelyn bringing up the rear. The mountain at night was a different world, full of sounds that might have been wind or animals or something worse, shadows that moved when she wasn't looking directly at them, cold that found every gap in her clothing and settled into her bones. But Rowan moved through it like he was part of it, his steps sure even in darkness, his sense of direction unerring. He led them along paths that were barely paths at all, more like suggestions carved into rock and root. Several times they had to climb down steep sections using rope Rowan had anchored to trees. Once they crossed a ravine on a fallen log that Evelyn was certain would break under their weight, but somehow held. The boys didn't complain. They were too focused on not falling, on keeping up, on proving they could handle whatever came next. After 4 hours of descent, they reached the tree line. The forest here was different, older, darker, the pines so thick overhead that no moonlight penetrated. Rowan pulled out a small lantern and lit it, the flame barely brighter than a candle. We're below the snow line now, he said quietly, but we're also in territory where sound carries. No talking unless necessary. If I stop, you stop. If I go to ground, you go to ground. Understood? They all nodded. The forest journey took another 3 hours. Evelyn lost all sense of direction within the first 30 minutes. Everything looked the same. Trees and darkness and the small circle of lantern light that seemed to only make the shadows deeper. But Rowan never hesitated. He moved like he'd walked this path 1,000 times, which he probably had. Eventually the trees began to thin and Evelyn could see starlight ahead. They emerged at the base of a cliff face that rose up into the darkness like a wall. Rowan moved along it, running his hand over the stone until he found what he was looking for, a seam, barely visible, where the rock had been cut and fitted back together. He pushed, and a section of the cliff face swung inward on hidden hinges. "Welcome to my brother's workshop," Rowan said, and led them inside. The space beyond was enormous, a natural cavern that had been expanded and shaped into something between a workshop and a fortress. Lanterns hung from chains, casting pools of light over workbenches covered with tools, metal parts, and things Evelyn couldn't identify. The walls were lined with barrels marked with skull and crossbones symbols. The smell was distinctive, sulfur and charcoal and something sharper that made her eyes water. And standing in the center of it all, a pistol pointed directly at Rowan's chest, was a man who looked so much like him it was startling. Same height, same build, same brutal bone structure. But where Rowan's face was scarred and weathered, this man's was unmarked. Where Rowan's eyes held the patience of stone, this man's burned with a manic intensity. "Hello, brother," the man said. His voice was higher than Rowan's, faster, edged with something unstable. 8 years, no word, and you show up in the middle of the night with a woman and 3 children. This should be interesting. Put the gun down, Nathaniel. Give me one reason why I should. Because I need your help. And because you owe me. Nathaniel's laugh was sharp and humorless. I owe you. I owe you. You left me to rot in that prison while you ran off to play mountain hermit. I spent 2 years in chains because of you, and you think I owe you? You were in chains because you blew up a bridge with a train on it. I didn't put the dynamite there. That was all you. I was trying to help the workers. The company was forcing them to build in unsafe conditions. I was trying to make a point. You made a point. You killed 6 people doing it. Rowan's voice was cold. I couldn't save you from that. No one could. But when you got out, who gave you the tools to start over? Who got you this contract with the mining company? Who made sure no one looked too closely at your past? The gun wavered slightly. You did. I did. So yes, brother, you owe me. Rowan gestured to Evelyn and the boys. These people need help, the same help I gave you, and you're going to provide it. Nathaniel lowered the gun slowly. His eyes moved over Evelyn, assessing her, then to the boys. Something in his expression softened slightly when he saw how young they were, how scared. What kind of help? He asked finally. The kind that involves explosives, chaos, and making the mayor of Raven's Fork wish he'd never been born. A slow smile spread across Nathaniel's face. It was not a comfortable smile. It was the smile of someone who'd been waiting for an excuse to burn something down. Now that, he said, I can help with. If you or someone you know is having a difficult time, free support is available. Find resources. Nathaniel Pike's workshop smelled like sulfur and ambition. He spread the documents across his largest workbench, his fingers tracing the incriminating numbers with the reverence most men reserve for holy texts. The lantern light caught the gleam in his eyes. Not greed, but something more dangerous. Recognition. Franklin Cole, he muttered, shaking his head. I should have known. The man comes down here twice a month, all smiles and handshakes, paying me to blast tunnels while he bleeds the company dry from above. He looked up at Rowan. You're certain these are authentic? Her husband kept them. Died because of them. Rowan's voice was flat. That authentic enough for you? Nathaniel glanced at Evelyn, who stood with her sons pressed against her sides. The boys were exhausted, swaying on their feet, but too afraid of this new stranger to sit down. Ma'am, Nathaniel said, and his voice had lost its manic edge. Your husband was a braver man than most. These ledgers could have bought his silence, could have earned him a fortune in hush money. Instead, he kept them as evidence. That takes integrity. It took his life, Evelyn said quietly. I'd rather have him back than his integrity. Fair enough. Nathaniel returned his attention to the documents. The Founders' Ball is in 48 hours. Cole will have security. Hired guns, probably 6 or 8 of them. The venue is the Grand Hall, which has exactly 2 entrances, both of which he'll be watching. Getting you inside will require a distraction significant enough that his men abandon their posts. How significant? Rowan asked. Nathaniel's smile returned, sharp and dangerous. How do you feel about fireworks? Over the next 2 days, the workshop became a war room. Nathaniel worked with the focused intensity of a man possessed, assembling devices he called theatrical displays, but which looked disturbingly like weapons. Rowan drilled Evelyn on what to say, how to say it, where to stand for maximum visibility. You'll have maybe 3 minutes before they throw you out, he told her. 3 minutes to make your case, show the evidence, turn the crowd against Cole. Every word has to count. What if they don't believe me? Evelyn's hand shook as she held the papers. What if they think I'm lying, that I forged these documents to get revenge? Then we'll have failed, and Cole will probably have us killed. Rowan said it like he was discussing the weather, which is why failure isn't acceptable. Samuel, who'd been listening from his corner, spoke up. What can we do? To help, I mean. Rowan studied the boy for a long moment. You stay safe, you stay hidden. You don't become leverage your mother has to worry about. We're always leverage, Samuel said, his voice bitter beyond his years. Everywhere we go, everything Mama does, she's thinking about us first. Maybe for once we could help instead of just being the reason she has to be afraid. The truth of it hit Evelyn like a physical blow. Her son was right. Every decision she'd made since Thomas died had been filtered through the lens of their safety. She'd rejected opportunities because they might be dangerous for the boys. She'd stayed quiet when she should have spoken because she feared retaliation against her children. She'd made herself small and powerless because that seemed like the best way to protect them. But it hadn't protected them. It had just made them into perpetual victims, running from town to town, always afraid, always one step ahead of disaster. Nathaniel cleared his throat. The boy has a point. If you want the crowd's sympathy, having your children visible will help. 3 young boys who've done nothing wrong, suffering for their father's one mistake. That's a powerful image. Absolutely not, Evelyn said immediately. I won't put them in danger. They're already in danger, Rowan said quietly. Have been since the moment Cole rejected you. The question is whether they face that danger hidden and powerless, or visible and fighting back. Evelyn looked at her sons. Samuel with his 2 old eyes, Caleb with his quiet strength, Joseph with his fragile hope. They deserved better than this. They deserved safety and childhood and futures that weren't defined by their father's desperate choice. But they also deserved to see their mother stand up, to know that sometimes you fought back even when the odds were impossible, to understand that dignity mattered more than safety. If we do this, she said slowly, you stay behind me. You don't speak unless I tell you to. And if things go wrong, you run. You don't wait for me. You don't try to help. You just run. Understood? All 3 boys nodded. On the morning of the founders' ball, Nathaniel presented Evelyn with a dress. It was simple, dark blue wool, clean lines, nothing fancy. But it fit properly. And when she put it on, she looked less like a desperate vagrant and more like a respectable widow. Where did you get this? She asked. Had it made. Paid a seamstress in town double her rate to have it ready in 1 day. Nathaniel adjusted the collar with surprising gentleness. If you're going to challenge a king, you need to look like you belong in the throne room. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Nathaniel would set up his theatrical displays at 3 locations around Raven's Fork, close enough to be dramatic, far enough to avoid actual casualties. At precisely 8 o'clock, when the ball was in full swing, the displays would ignite. The resulting chaos would draw Cole's security away from the grand hall. In that window, Rowan would get Evelyn and the boys inside through the kitchen entrance, which would be temporarily unmanned. Once inside, Evelyn would make her way to the main ballroom and confront Cole before he realized what was happening. The crowd would see everything, hear everything. There would be no way to silence her without confirming everything she accused him of. And after? Evelyn asked. After I've said my piece and shown the evidence, what then? Then we see if the truth matters more than power, Rowan said, and we prepare to fight our way out if it doesn't. They left the workshop at dusk. Nathaniel went ahead to position his devices. Rowan led Evelyn and the boys through the forest on yet another hidden path, this one descending toward Raven's Fork from the east side, where the terrain was too steep for normal settlement. As they walked, Rowan fell back to walk beside Evelyn. There's something you should know, he said quietly. About me. About why I'm up on that mountain. You don't have to tell me. I do. Because if things go bad tonight, you should know who you're trusting. He was silent for a moment, choosing his words. 8 years ago, I worked for the territorial marshal, tracked down criminals, brought them in for trial. I was good at it, too good. They started sending me after harder targets, more dangerous men. He paused, and Evelyn waited. There was a man named Garrett Cross. He'd killed 6 people, robbed twice that many. I tracked him to a homestead outside Denver, found him hiding in the barn. He surrendered without a fight, hands up, asking for mercy. Rowan's voice had gone hollow. I should have arrested him, should have brought him in, but I was tired. Tired of chasing, tired of seeing him lawyer his way out of consequences like so many others had. So I shot him, executed him right there, unarmed and surrendering. Evelyn's breath caught, but she didn't speak. The marshal covered it up, called it self-defense, said Cross had gone for a weapon. But I knew what I'd done. I'd murdered a man because it was easier than trusting the system to deliver justice. So I turned in my badge and left. Came to the mountain to disappear, to punish myself by living alone, to make sure I never had power over another person's life again. Why are you telling me this? Because tonight, I might have to make similar choices. And you should know that I'm capable of it, that I've crossed lines most men wouldn't even approach. He looked at her directly. I'm not a good man, Mrs. Hart. I'm just a man who's trying to do one good thing before the end. Evelyn reached out and touched his arm. Thomas used to say that good men don't exist, only men who keep trying despite their failures. I think you're one of those. Rowan didn't respond, but something in his expression softened. They reached the outskirts of Raven's Fork just as full darkness fell. The town was alive with light and music. The Grand Hall stood at the center, 3 stories of imported timber and glass, glowing like a lantern. Well-dressed people moved through the streets, heading toward the celebration. Rowan led them to a stable behind a boarding house. Wait here. I'm going to check Nathaniel's positions, make sure everything's ready. Don't move. Don't talk to anyone. I'll be back in 20 minutes. He disappeared into the shadows. The boys huddled close to their mother, watching the celebration through gaps in the stable walls. Somewhere inside that bright building, Mayor Franklin Cole was holding court, confident in his power, certain that his secrets were safe. He had no idea that his world was about to burn. Rowan returned exactly 20 minutes later. Nathaniel's in position. Devices are set. We have until 8 o'clock, 15 minutes. He looked at Evelyn. Last chance to change your mind. We can leave right now. Head north to those mining camps I mentioned. You could build a quiet life there. Safe. Anonymous. Evelyn thought about it. Really thought about it. A quiet life sounded wonderful. Safety for her son sounded like heaven. But Thomas would still be dead. His name would still be stained. And Franklin Cole would still be stealing and lying and destroying lives without consequence. No, she said. We're doing this. At precisely 8 o'clock, the first explosion lit up the night sky. It wasn't loud so much as bright, a fountain of colored sparks erupting from the roof of the assay office, red and gold and blue cascading like a waterfall of light. People in the streets stopped and pointed, delighted by the unexpected display. Then the second device triggered, this one on the far side of town. More sparks, more colors, and this time accompanied by a sound like thunder rolling through the mountains. The third explosion was the largest. It erupted from the bell tower of the town hall, sending streamers of silver fire hundreds of feet into the air. The crowd gasped and cheered, thinking it was part of the celebration. But inside the grand hall, Cole's security detail wasn't cheering. Evelyn watched through a window as 4 men in dark suits rushed out the front entrance, heading toward the disturbances. 2 more exited through the back. Now, Rowan said. They moved quickly. The kitchen entrance was exactly where Nathaniel said it would be, and exactly as unguarded as he'd promised. They slipped inside past hanging pots and startled cooks too busy preparing food to question why a widow and 3 children were entering through the back. The hallway beyond led to a servant's stair. Rowan led them up, moving with the confidence of someone who'd memorized the building's layout. At the top, they emerged into a gallery overlooking the main ballroom. The sight below was staggering. Hundreds of people in their finest clothes, dancing and drinking and laughing. Crystal chandeliers threw rainbow light across polished floors. A string quartet played in one corner. Tables laden with food lined the walls. And at the center of it all, holding court like a king, was Mayor Franklin Cole. He was laughing at something a woman had said, his face flushed with wine and self-satisfaction. Around him clustered Ravens Fork's elite, mine investors, business owners, territorial officials. These were the people who mattered, the ones with money and influence. These were the witnesses Evelyn needed. "Remember the plan," Rowan whispered. "You walk down those stairs, you head straight for Cole, you speak loud and clear. Don't let them interrupt you. Don't let them silence you. And no matter what happens, don't back down." Evelyn nodded. Her heart was hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Her hands were slick with sweat. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, to protect her children by staying invisible. But she was done being invisible. She descended the stairs with her sons behind her. Heads turned as they passed. Conversations died. The music continued, but people were starting to notice the woman in the simple blue dress, the three thin boys, the way they moved with purpose toward the center of the room. Cole saw her when she was still 20 feet away. His smile faltered, his eyes narrowed. He said something to the man beside him, who immediately started moving toward Evelyn. She had seconds, maybe less. Evelyn raised her voice, projecting it the way she used to when calling her sons in from the yard. "Mayor Cole, I have something to show you." The music stopped. The entire ballroom fell silent. Hundreds of eyes turned toward her. Cole's face went through several expressions: confusion, recognition, anger, calculation, before settling on concerned confusion. "Mrs. Hart, isn't it? I'm afraid this is a private event. If you need assistance, I'm sure Sheriff Morrison can help you find appropriate lodging for—" "I don't need lodging. I need justice." Evelyn pulled the documents from her dress and held them high. "These are accounting records from the Ravens Fork Mining Company. They show systematic embezzlement over the course of 3 years. $73,000 stolen through fake expenses and fraudulent contractor payments." The crowd murmured. Cole's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady. "My dear woman, I don't know where you got those papers, but I assure you they're forgeries. The mining company's books are regularly audited and found to be— My husband audited them, Thomas Hart. You hired him last spring to sort out your accounts before the territorial inspection. He found the discrepancies and documented them. He kept these copies as evidence." Evelyn's voice didn't shake. "And when he tried to report what he'd found, you arranged for him to be accused of theft. You destroyed his reputation so thoroughly that no one would believe anything he said. You drove him to kill himself to protect your secrets." The murmuring grew louder. Cole's eyes darted around the room, searching for his security, but they were still outside chasing Nathaniel's fireworks. "This is slander," Cole said, his voice hardening. "This woman's husband was a proven thief. She's desperate and grief-stricken, and she's making wild accusations to—" "The proof is right here." Evelyn walked forward and thrust the documents at the nearest well-dressed man, a portly gentleman with wire-rimmed glasses who she'd heard someone call Mr. Hutchinson. "You're an investor, aren't you? You put money into the mining company. Look at the entries. Look at what's been stolen from you." Hutchinson took the papers hesitantly. His eyes scanned the pages, and his expression shifted from skepticism to confusion to fury. "These are legitimate ledgers. I recognize the company seal. And these numbers, Cole, these show payments to contractors we never authorized, equipment we never purchased. Let me see those." Another man stepped forward, younger, sharper. He took the papers and examined them with the eye of someone who knew how to read financial records. "She's right. This is embezzlement, clear as day. And if her husband found this, that means—" He looked up at Cole. "That means you had motive to silence him, to destroy him before he could expose you." Cole's mask was cracking. "This is ridiculous. I'm the mayor of this town, a respected businessman. I won't stand here and be accused by some vagrant widow who—" "You called my husband a thief," Evelyn said, and her voice cut through his bluster like a blade. "You told the whole town he was a criminal. You used his one desperate act to save our dying son as proof that he was worthless. You rejected me and my children on Christmas Eve and sent us into a blizzard to die. And you did it all to protect your own crimes." She turned to face the crowd, addressing all of them now. "My husband made a mistake. He borrowed money he couldn't pay back because I was desperate to save our son's life. It was wrong. He knew it was wrong, and the shame of it killed him. But his mistake was born of love. What was yours born of, Mayor Cole? What excuse do you have for stealing from your own investors, from your own town? The silence was absolute. Every person in that ballroom was staring at Cole now, seeing him with new eyes. The comfortable certainty that he was their leader, their protector, was crumbling. Cole seemed to realize he'd lost control of the room. His hand moved toward his coat pocket. Rowan was faster. He'd moved down from the gallery during Evelyn's speech, positioning himself behind Cole. When the mayor's hand went for what was probably a derringer, Rowan caught his wrist and twisted. The gun clattered to the floor. "I wouldn't," Rowan said quietly. "Not in front of all these witnesses." Cole's face had gone from pale to red. "You have no authority here, Pike. You're nothing but a hermit, a murderer hiding in the mountains. No one will believe anything you— They don't have to believe me." Rowan released Cole's wrist and stepped back. "The documents speak for themselves, and I'm guessing once territorial authorities start investigating, they'll find even more evidence. Hidden accounts, falsified records, maybe even proof of what you did to pressure Mr. Hart into silence." A new voice cut through the tension. "That won't be necessary." Everyone turned. A man stood in the doorway, tall, distinguished, wearing the formal uniform of a territorial marshal. Behind him stood 3 deputies, all armed. "I'm Marshal Robert Trent," the man said, walking into the ballroom. "I've been investigating irregularities in the Ravens Fork Mining Company for 6 months, but we've been lacking concrete evidence. Until now." He gestured to the documents Hutchinson still held. "I'll need to examine those, along with any other records Mrs. Hart's husband may have kept." Evelyn pulled the second packet from her dress. Copies Nathaniel had made, insurance in case something happened to the originals. She handed them to the marshal with trembling hands. Trent scanned them quickly, his expression growing darker. "Franklin Cole, you're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. Gentlemen, take him into custody." The deputies moved forward. Cole tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. The crowd that had always parted for him now formed a wall, blocking his escape. "This is a mistake," Cole said, his voice rising with panic. "You're making a terrible mistake. I'm the mayor. I'm a respected—" "You're a thief," Marshal Trent said flatly. "And if we find evidence linking you to Thomas Hart's death, you'll hang for it." The deputies locked irons around Cole's wrists. He looked around the ballroom, searching for allies, for someone who would speak in his defense. No one did. The same people who'd celebrated with him moments ago now looked away, unwilling to be associated with his fall. As the deputies led Cole toward the door, he passed close to Evelyn. For a moment their eyes met. "You've destroyed me," he said quietly. "I hope you're proud." "I'm not proud," Evelyn said. "I'm just done being afraid." Cole was taken away. The ballroom erupted into chaos, people shouting questions, demanding answers, clustering around Marshal Trent and the investors. But Evelyn barely heard it. Her legs gave out, and she sat down hard on the polished floor, adrenaline draining away and leaving her hollow. Samuel, Caleb, and Joseph crowded around her, and she pulled them close, breathing in the smell of their hair, feeling their hearts beating against her. "Is it over, Mama?" Joseph asked. "I think so, baby. I think it's over." But even as she said it, she heard shouts from outside. Gunfire. Rowan was already moving toward the door. "Stay here," he ordered. "Don't move." He disappeared into the night. More shots rang out, closer now. The crowd in the ballroom surged toward the exits, panic replacing their earlier curiosity. Evelyn pulled her sons under one of the refreshment tables, shielding them with her body. Through the press of legs and chaos, she could see the main entrance. A man stumbled through it, blood soaking his shirt. He wore a deputy's badge. "They got the marshal," he gasped. "Cole's men. They were waiting outside. They killed Marshal Trent and freed Cole." He collapsed before he could finish. The ballroom descended into complete chaos. People screamed and pushed toward the exits. Glass shattered. Somewhere, a woman was sobbing. Evelyn's mind raced. Cole was free. He'd killed a territorial marshal. He had nothing left to lose, which made him infinitely more dangerous, and he knew exactly where she was. The shooting outside intensified. Through the windows, she could see muzzle flashes, shadows moving in the darkness. Someone was fighting, probably Rowan, possibly Nathaniel. Then she heard boots on the stairs above. Heavy, purposeful, coming down. Sheriff Morrison appeared at the top of the gallery, and he had a rifle. His eyes scanned the chaos below until they found Evelyn huddled under the table. "Mrs. Hart," he called out. His voice was almost apologetic. "Mayor Cole would like a word with you, and your sons, outside. Now!" He raised the rifle, pointing it directly at her. Evelyn stood slowly, pushing her boys behind her. "Leave them out of this. Whatever Cole wants, he can take it up with me." "Not how this works." Morrison gestured with the rifle. "All of you, outside. Don't make me shoot you in front of all these nice people." There was no choice. Evelyn took Joseph's hand, and Samuel took Caleb's, and together they walked toward the door. The crowd parted for them, but no one tried to help. They were all too afraid, too shocked, too focused on their own survival to risk themselves for a widow and 3 boys. Outside, the street was a war zone. Bodies lay sprawled in the dirt. Deputies, Cole's hired guns, bystanders caught in the crossfire. Buildings burned where stray shots had ignited oil lamps. And in the center of it all, holding a pistol to Rowan's head, was Franklin Cole. The mayor's fine clothes were torn and bloodied. His face was a mask of rage and desperation, but his hand was steady on the gun. "Mrs. Hart," he said when he saw her. "How kind of you to join us. I believe we have some unfinished business." "Let him go," Evelyn said. "Your fight is with me, not him." "Oh, I disagree. My fight is with everyone who thought they could destroy me. You, Pike, his lunatic brother who probably set those explosions." Cole pressed the gun harder against Rowan's temple. "But you're right about one thing. This ends tonight. All of it." A shot rang out. Cole staggered, blood blooming across his shoulder. The gun fell from his hand. Nathaniel stepped out from behind a burning building, a smoking rifle in his hands. "You were saying, Mayor?" Cole clutched his shoulder, his face twisted with pain and fury. He reached for the fallen pistol with his good hand. Another shot. This one didn't come from Nathaniel. Sheriff Morrison, still standing in the doorway of the Grand Hall, lowered his rifle slowly. The bullet had taken Cole in the chest, dropping him to his knees. "Should have paid me better," Morrison said quietly. "Maybe then I would have been loyal." Cole fell forward into the dirt. His breathing was labored, bubbling. He tried to say something, but blood filled his mouth. Evelyn walked over to him and knelt down. She didn't feel triumph or satisfaction, just exhaustion and a strange kind of pity. "I didn't want this," she said. "I just wanted you to tell the truth, to admit what you'd done, to let us live in peace." Cole's eyes found hers. He tried to speak again, and this time she could make out the words. "Should have let you freeze." Then he died. Rowan pulled himself free from Cole's dead grip and immediately went to Evelyn, checking her for injuries. "Are you hurt? The boys?" "We're fine." She looked around at the carnage, the burning buildings, the bodies. "Is this what justice looks like?" "Sometimes," Rowan said. "Sometimes it's messy and violent and nothing like we hope it will be. But it's still justice." More riders were coming, territorial lawmen drawn by the explosions and gunfire. Within the hour, the street was filled with authorities sorting through the aftermath, taking statements, trying to piece together what had happened. Evelyn told them everything about Thomas's discovery, Cole's embezzlement, the attempt to silence them. The surviving investors corroborated her story, eager to distance themselves from Cole's crimes. Nathaniel explained the fireworks, emphasizing they'd been designed for spectacle, not harm. By dawn, it was over. Cole was dead, his conspirators arrested, and Evelyn's testimony was documented and filed with the territorial court. A lawyer approached her as the sun rose. "Mrs. Hart, the mining company's board would like to offer compensation. Your husband's discoveries saved the investors from further losses. They feel you're entitled to a reward." "How much?" She was too tired to be diplomatic. $5,000, and a formal apology acknowledging that your husband was a man of integrity who acted heroically to expose corruption. $5,000. More money than Thomas had earned in his entire life. More than enough to give her sons a future. "I'll take it," she said. "On one condition. My husband's name is cleared. Officially. In writing. I want it stated publicly that Thomas Hart was not a thief, but a whistleblower who was destroyed for trying to do the right thing. The lawyer nodded. I'll make sure it's in the formal statement. Evelyn walked back to where Rowan stood with Nathaniel and her sons. They all looked as exhausted as she felt. What now? Samuel asked. Evelyn looked at Rowan, then at the mountains rising behind the town. She thought about the cave, the warmth, the safety of stone walls and crackling fire. She thought about the mining camps to the north, the possibility of building something new. She thought about all the places she could go, all the lives she could try to build. But mostly she thought about how tired she was of running. Now, she said, we rest. The rest Evelyn had promised turned out to be more complicated than she'd imagined. Raven's Fork wanted to make amends, wanted to transform her from villain to victim to hero in the span of a single night. Within days of Cole's death, the town council offered her a house, one of Cole's properties, ironically, seized by the territorial government and redistributed as restitution. She stood on the porch of that house 3 days after the confrontation, looking at its painted shutters and glass windows and sturdy roof. It was everything she'd dreamed of during those frozen nights in the wagon. Safety, warmth, respectability. It felt like a coffin. You're not going to take it, are you? Rowan stood beside her, reading her expression the way he'd learned to do over their days together. They're trying to buy forgiveness, Evelyn said quietly, trying to convince themselves they're good people who made an understandable mistake. But they weren't mistaken. They were cruel. They turned us away knowing we'd die, and they did it because it was easier than showing mercy. So what will you do? Evelyn looked past the town toward the mountains rising in the distance. You mentioned mining camps. North, over the divide. Are they really there? 3 of them. Rough places. Men working claims that'll probably never pay out. Living in tents and shacks, fighting the mountain for every ounce of copper and silver. He paused. But they're real. And they're far enough from here that nobody cares what your last name is or what your husband did. Would they accept us? A widow with 3 boys? They'd accept anyone willing to work. The camps need everything. Cooking, sewing, teaching, doctoring. Women are scarce up there. A woman with skills? You'd be invaluable. He met her eyes. But it won't be easy. Winters are harder than anything you've seen. Summer brings floods and rock slides. And the men can be rough. Dangerous sometimes. More dangerous than dying in a blizzard? More dangerous than a mayor who wanted us dead? Rowan's scarred mouth quirked into something almost like a smile. Fair point. That evening, Evelyn gathered her sons in the boarding house room the town had provided temporarily. She'd put off this conversation, afraid of their reaction, but they deserved to know what she was considering. We're not staying in Raven's Fork, she said without preamble. I know the town's offered us a home, money, apologies, but I don't want their guilt. I want a fresh start where nobody knows us, nobody judges us, nobody tries to make us into something we're not. Samuel nodded slowly. He was the one who'd understand, who'd felt the weight of those stares, those whispers. Where would we go? There are mining camps north of here, small communities, hard living, but honest work. Rowan says they need people who can cook, sew, teach. I could do all of that. We could build something there. Something that's ours, not handed to us out of obligation. Would Rowan come with us? Joseph asked, and there was hope in his young voice that made Evelyn's chest tight. I don't know, baby. That's his choice to make. You should ask him. Caleb spoke up, surprising everyone. He was usually the quiet one, content to let his brothers do the talking. He saved us. He helped us. He stood with us when nobody else would. That means something. It did mean something. More than Evelyn had wanted to admit. Over the past weeks, Rowan Pike had become more than just their rescuer. He'd become the steady presence she relied on, the strength she borrowed when her own ran out. The thought of walking away from him, of taking her boys north while he returned to his solitary cave, felt wrong in a way she couldn't quite articulate. But she also wouldn't presume. Wouldn't assume that his help meant anything beyond basic human decency. He'd given them shelter, protection, justice. She had no right to ask for more. The next morning, she found him in the stable behind the boarding house, checking on the horse he'd brought down from the mountain. The animal was in better shape than Evelyn's old mare, which had finally given up and died 2 days after they'd reached town. "I'm taking the mining camp offer," she said. "The boys and I. We're leaving in 3 days as soon as I can get supplies together." Rowan continued brushing the horse, his movements steady and rhythmic. "Smart choice. Staying here would be like living in a cage made of apologies. I wanted to thank you for everything. We wouldn't have survived without you. We certainly wouldn't have gotten justice for Thomas without your help and Nathaniel's." She paused. "I don't know how to repay that kind of debt." "You don't owe me anything." He set down the brush and finally looked at her. "You paid whatever debt existed the moment you stood up in that ballroom and told the truth. That took more courage than anything I've done. I was terrified." "I know. That's what made it courage." He was quiet for a moment. "The mining camps, they're 4 days' travel from here, rough trail, especially with children. You'll need someone who knows the way." Hope flared in Evelyn's chest. "Are you offering?" "I'm saying you shouldn't make that journey alone. And I'm saying I know those camps, know the people who run them, know which ones are safe and which ones aren't." He picked up the brush again, not meeting her eyes. "Someone should guide you. Make sure you get there in one piece." It wasn't a declaration, it wasn't even really an offer, but it was the closest thing to commitment that Rowan Pike seemed capable of giving. "We'd be grateful for a guide," Evelyn said carefully, "for as long as you're willing to provide one." Something shifted in his expression. Relief, maybe, or something deeper that he wouldn't name. They left Raven's Fork on a morning so clear and cold that the air seemed to ring like crystal. The town turned out to see them off, which Evelyn found grimly amusing. The same people who'd watched them leave to die in a blizzard now waved and called out good wishes, already rewriting history in their minds. But there were a few genuine goodbyes. Mr. Hutchinson, the investor who'd first examined the ledgers, pressed a package into Evelyn's hands. "Food for the journey, and a letter of introduction to the superintendent at the Copper Ridge camp. Tell him I sent you. He'll treat you fairly." The seamstress who'd made Evelyn's dress for the ball gave each of the boys a warm scarf. "You were very brave," she told Samuel. "All of you. Your father would be proud." It was the first time anyone in Raven's Fork had spoken of Thomas with respect. Samuel's eyes filled with tears, but he blinked them back and thanked her. Nathaniel met them at the edge of town. He'd packed his own supplies, his saddlebags bulging with mysterious packages that probably contained explosives. "You're coming too?" Evelyn asked, surprised. "Someone needs to keep my brother out of trouble. Besides, mining camps always need someone who knows how to blast rock safely." He grinned. "Figured I'd make myself useful." So their party became 5. Evelyn, 3 boys, and 2 brothers who'd barely spoken in 8 years, but now moved together with the ease of men who understood each other's silences. The journey north was nothing like the desperate flight that had brought Evelyn to Raven's Fork. They traveled at a reasonable pace, stopping to camp when the boys grew tired, taking time to hunt and fish and rest. Rowan taught Samuel how to read trail signs, showed Caleb how to start a fire with wet wood, let Joseph ride on his shoulders when the path grew too steep. At night, around the campfire, Nathaniel told wild stories about his explosives work that were probably half lies but made the boys laugh. Rowan carved small figures from wood, a horse for Joseph, a wolf for Caleb, an eagle for Samuel. Evelyn mended their clothes and cooked their meals, and slowly felt the knots of fear and desperation that had lived in her chest begin to loosen. On the 4th day, they crested a ridge and looked down at Copper Ridge Camp. It was exactly as rough as Rowan had promised. Maybe 100 structures scattered across a valley, tents, lean-tos, a few actual cabins built from scrap lumber. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys. The sound of picks striking stone echoed off the surrounding cliffs. But there were also gardens, carefully tended despite the short growing season, clotheslines strung between buildings, children playing in the dirt, the signs of people trying to build lives, not just extract wealth. "It's not much," Rowan said. "It's enough," Evelyn replied. The camp superintendent was a man named Douglas Kern, grizzled and practical, who read Hutchinson's letter and looked Evelyn up and down with assessing eyes. "Can you really cook for 50 men?" "I can cook for 100 if you've got the supplies." Can you teach reading and arithmetic to the children? I was a school teacher before I married. Can you keep your head in a crisis? We get accidents up here. Cave-ins, injuries, sometimes worse. Need people who won't panic. Evelyn thought about driving a broken wagon through a blizzard, about performing surgery on Rowan's gunshot wound with trembling hands, about standing in a ballroom and accusing a mayor of murder while armed men surrounded her. I don't panic, she said. Kern nodded slowly. You're hired. $20 a month plus room and board for you and the boys. We've got a cabin that's been empty since the Johnsons moved on. It's small, but it's solid. You can have it.
Das muchachos.
John, the cabin was tiny. One room with a loft, a stone fireplace, gaps between the wall logs that would need chinking before winter. But it had a door that locked, and windows that opened, and a view of mountains that made Evelyn's heart lift every time she looked at them. What do you think? She asked her sons. Samuel walked the perimeter, testing the floorboards, checking the roof beams. It's sturdy. We can make it work. Caleb was already planning. We'll need firewood, a lot of it. And we should build a storage shed before the snow comes. Joseph just smiled, the first genuine smile Evelyn had seen from him in months. It feels safe, Mama, like nobody can hurt us here. That night, after the boys had fallen asleep in the loft, Evelyn sat outside on the small porch, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Rowan approached silently, the way he always did, and sat down beside her without asking permission. You did good, he said. The boys are settling in. You found work. This is a good place for a fresh start. Thanks to you. You would have made it here eventually. You're tougher than you think. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Evelyn asked the question she'd been avoiding. What about you? Will you go back to your cave now? Return to the mountain? Rowan was quiet for a long time. That cave was a hiding place, a punishment I gave myself for things I'd done. But living there, alone, never speaking to anyone for weeks at a time, that wasn't healing. That was just slow dying. What changed? You did. Your boys did. He looked at her, and in the starlight, his scarred face seemed less frightening and more human. I spent 8 years convincing myself I didn't deserve connection, didn't deserve family, didn't deserve anything but isolation. Then you showed up half frozen and desperate, and for the first time in years, I had a purpose beyond just surviving. I remembered what it felt like to matter to someone. Evelyn's breath caught. You matter, Rowan, to all of us. You saved our lives. You saved mine too. You just did it differently. He stood up, and for a moment she thought he was leaving, but instead he reached down and took her hand, pulling her to her feet. Nathaniel and I talked. We're going to stay, set up a proper explosives operation, work the camps, make ourselves useful. That cabin down by the creek, the one Kern said was available for skilled workers, we're taking it. You're staying. Evelyn repeated it, needing to hear the words again to believe them. I'm staying, if that's all right with you. Relief and something deeper washed over her. It's more than all right. He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his face, and Evelyn understood why the town had feared him. Not because he was dangerous, but because he was authentic in a way that made other people's pretenses uncomfortable. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm that felt almost like peace. Evelyn cooked breakfast for the miners before dawn, taught reading and writing to a dozen children in the afternoon, sewed and mended in the evening. Her boys thrived. Samuel appointed himself protector of the younger children. Caleb discovered a talent for carpentry. Joseph's cough finally healed in the dry mountain air. Rowan and Nathaniel built a workshop and began carefully expanding the mining operations, their controlled explosions opening new veins of ore. Rowan was different here than he'd been in the cave. Still quiet, still watchful, but no longer isolated. He taught the boys to hunt, helped Evelyn repair the cabin's roof, sat with her in the evenings, and talked about everything and nothing. Winter came early and hard. The first snow fell in October, and by November the valley was buried under 3 feet of white. But the cabin was warm, the food stores were adequate, and Evelyn found herself genuinely happy for the first time since Thomas died. It was during that first winter that the proposal came. They were sitting by the fire one evening, the boys asleep in the loft, when Rowan said, I've been thinking about the future. That's unusually optimistic for you. He huffed a laugh. I'm trying something new, being hopeful. He poked the fire, sending up sparks. The boys need a father, not to replace Thomas. Nobody could do that. But someone to teach them, guide them, keep them safe. And you need a partner. Someone to share the burden of building a life up here. Evelyn's heart began to pound. What are you saying, Rowan? I'm saying I'm not good with words, so I'll be direct. I want to marry you. Not because you need rescuing or because I need redemption, but because I love you. Because I love those boys. Because when I imagine the future, you're all in it, and when you're not, the future looks empty. It wasn't a romantic proposal. There was no kneeling, no ring, no flowery declarations. It was pure Rowan, honest, direct, slightly awkward. It was perfect. Yes, Evelyn said. Yes, I'll marry you. He looked at her like he'd expected rejection, like her acceptance was a gift he didn't deserve. Then he leaned over and kissed her, gentle and tentative, and Evelyn felt something inside her that had been frozen since Thomas died finally begin to thaw. They married in spring when the snow melted and wildflowers covered the valley. The ceremony was simple. Superintendent Kern officiating, the whole camp in attendance, Nathaniel standing as witness with a grin that suggested he'd seen this coming long before they had. When Kern asked if anyone objected, Joseph shouted, "No!" so loudly that everyone laughed. Samuel and Caleb stood beside Rowan, solemn and proud, already thinking of him as the father they'd lost. Evelyn wore the blue dress from the confrontation, altered now with lace that the camp seamstress had added. Rowan wore a clean shirt and had trimmed his beard. They both looked nervous and happy, and slightly overwhelmed by the idea that they were building something new together. After the ceremony, as the camp celebrated with music and dancing and food, Evelyn found herself standing at the edge of the gathering, watching her sons play with the other children. Rowan came up beside her and slipped his arm around her waist. "Regrets?" he asked. "None. You?" "Only that I didn't find you sooner." She leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. "We found each other when we needed to. That's what matters." The years that followed weren't easy. Mining camps rarely were. There were accidents and illnesses, harsh winters and failed claims, men who drank too much and fights that turned ugly. But through it all, Evelyn and Rowan built something solid. The cabin expanded, first a proper bedroom, then a workshop for Rowan, then a schoolroom where Evelyn taught reading and arithmetic to a growing number of children. Samuel grew into a young man with his father's integrity and his stepfather's quiet strength. Caleb became the camp's best carpenter. Joseph, the sickly child who'd nearly died a dozen times, grew tall and strong and became a medic's apprentice. Nathaniel remained their neighbor and friend, his explosives expertise making him invaluable to the camps. He never married, claiming he was too unstable for domestic life, but he became the favorite uncle to Evelyn's boys and eventually to the two daughters she and Rowan had together. Word spread about Copper Ridge, about the widow who'd stood up to a corrupt mayor and won, about the mountain man who'd saved her and her sons, about the community they'd built where people were judged by their work and character, not their past mistakes. Other rejected families began to arrive, people fleeing debts, crimes, shame, poverty. Evelyn turned none of them away. She knew too well what it felt like to be desperate and denied. The camp grew from 100 people to 300, from a temporary settlement to a permanent town. They named it Haven. Evelyn hadn't suggested the name, but when the camp council proposed it, she didn't object. It was accurate. This was a haven for people who needed one, built by people who understood what it meant to have nowhere else to go. 5 years after Evelyn stood in that ballroom and confronted Franklin Cole, a reporter from Denver traveled to Haven to write about the widow who'd exposed corruption and built a town in the wilderness. She found Evelyn teaching a class of 20 children, her hair graying now but her eyes still sharp and determined. Rowan was outside showing Samuel and a group of young men how to safely set charges for a new mine shaft. The daughters, Margaret and Anna, were helping Nathaniel in his workshop, learning chemistry and mathematics alongside explosives safety. "People say you're a hero," the reporter said, "that you stood up to power and won, that you built something remarkable here." Evelyn considered the question while watching her students work through their arithmetic problems. "I'm not a hero. I was a desperate woman who got lucky. The real heroes were the people who helped when they didn't have to. Rowan, who opened his door when the whole town closed theirs. Nathaniel, who risked everything to help us expose the truth. Even Thomas, who kept evidence of corruption when it would have been easier and safer to stay silent. What would you say to other women in similar situations? Women who've been rejected, cast out, told they're not worthy. Evelyn looked out the window at the town she'd helped build, at the families who'd found safety here, at her sons working alongside the man who'd chosen to be their father. I'd say don't accept other people's judgment of your worth. They don't know your story. They don't know your strength. And I'd say that sometimes home isn't where you're born or where you're welcomed. Sometimes home is what you build when everyone else turns you away. Sometimes home is the people who stand beside you when standing alone would be easier. Sometimes home is just deciding you're done running and you're going to fight instead. She paused, thinking back to that Christmas Eve when the mayor's words had cut through her like a blade, when she'd driven her wagon into the mountains with no hope and 3 starving boys. But mostly I'd tell them what Rowan told me, the night everything changed. When you've been rejected everywhere else, when you're certain you're going to die alone and afraid, sometimes you just need one person to open their door and say the words that make all the difference. What words were those? The reporter asked. Evelyn smiled, remembering the scarred mountain man standing in his cave entrance, remembering the warmth of the fire behind him, remembering the moment when fear began to transform into hope. "You're home now," she said quietly. "That's all. Just 3 words. You're home now." And suddenly, impossibly, I was. The reporter left the next day with her story. It was published in newspapers across 3 territories, and more families came. More rejected, desperate people looking for the place where they'd be told they belonged. Evelyn welcomed them all. She taught their children, fed their hungry, found work for their willing hands. And to each new arrival, each family stepping off the trail exhausted and afraid, and certain they'd finally run out of places to run, she said the same thing Rowan had said to her all those years ago. "You're home now. You're safe. And you're welcome here for as long as you need." Because she remembered what it felt like to hear those words when you'd given up hope. She remembered how they could change everything, how they could save not just a life but a future. Years later, long after the reporter's story had faded from memory, long after Haven had become prosperous enough to attract people who'd never known rejection, Evelyn sat on her porch with Rowan, watching the sun set over the mountains. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked. "When you found us under the wagon?" "Sometimes. I think about how close you came to dying, how easily I could have stayed in the cave and never known." "What made you come out? In all that time you've never really said." Rowan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I heard your youngest crying. The sound carried even through the storm, and I thought about how many people probably heard him and chose to ignore it, chose to stay warm and safe, and tell themselves it wasn't their problem. And I realized I could be one of those people, or I could be someone different, someone who walked into the storm instead of hiding from it." "I'm glad you chose the storm." "So am I." He took her hand, his thumb tracing the calluses she'd earned from years of work. "You know what the funny thing is? I thought I was saving you, but you saved me too. You gave me a reason to come down from that mountain, to stop punishing myself, to believe I could be more than my worst mistake." Evelyn leaned her head on his shoulder. "We saved each other. That's how it works when you actually love someone." The sun dropped below the peaks, painting the sky gold and crimson. Somewhere in the town below, children laughed and played. Somewhere, families sat down to dinner in homes they'd built with their own hands. Somewhere, people who'd been rejected everywhere else had finally found the place where they belonged. And on the porch of a small cabin that had grown into a home, a widow and a mountain man sat together in the gathering darkness, grateful for the storm that had brought them together, grateful for the courage it had taken to keep fighting, grateful for the simple miracle of being home. The end.